Hi, and welcome to the CDFM study group. My name is Helen Thomas, and today what I want to do for you is to begin review of the CDFM Module 1 2018 Study Guide. So as you know, the ASMC, American Society of Military Comptrollers, have already began testing on the 2018 study guides. So we're in September and they will not begin training and testing until October, but they began the testing part of it. So I want to go ahead and start the review of that material. So I'm coming out of the 2018 study guides, CDFM Module 1.1, which is called the Resource Management Environment. So a lot of this information is similar to the 2013 that you will see we've already reviewed, but I want to ensure that we don't miss anything in the 2018. So I'm going to start from the beginning. So be sure to subscribe so as I continue to upload the new videos, you'll be able to get the emails to let you know that you can start checking the website on my YouTube channel. So beginning on page 115, which is the federal legislative process, there's no change there. History is history. It's already happened. So you see it runs from the Declaration of Independence all the way to the enactment of the U.S. Constitution. A couple of things to note on this page is to ensure that you understand that to do an amendment of the Constitution, it requires a unanimous vote of all the states. So on the bottom there of that page, any amendment to the Articles of Confederation required unanimous vote. The principle of separation of powers, that's why we now have three branches of government to put in those checks and balances to ensure that no part of the government had more control than the other. So the next page deals with the roles and responsibilities of the three branches of government. So it looks like that information is pretty much the same as the 2013. Again, the responsibilities of Congress on the following page is Article 1. So the order in which you need to learn the three branches of government is legislative or Congress, executive or the president, and the judicial branch. And the reason you should learn them in that order, because based on the Constitution, Article 1 governs Congress or the legislative branch, Article 2 governs the executive branch, and Article 3 governs the judicial branch. So make sure you know under Article 1 the things that Congress are allowed to do. Talks about raising taxes, borrow money, declare war. And also your House of Representatives, they serve 2-year terms. Your senators serve 6-year terms. Bills generate in the House of Representatives. What else? The key things on also with Congress is to remember the reason the government shuts down when we don't have a new appropriation is based on Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, because it says no money shall be drawn. You can't take any money out of the Treasury unless you have an appropriation law, a valid appropriation law. So when you hear about government shutdowns and so forth, the reason is because of this particular part of the Constitution that requires the Treasury to have a valid appropriation law. The executive branch, which makes up by the president, is governed under Article 2 of the Constitution. President serves 4-year term, also serve as commander of the armed forces, and the president will also provide information to Congress as far as his recommendation, things that he plans to do in his following year, and give those recommendations to Congress in the State of the Union address. I know a lot of people don't really pay attention to the State of the Union, but that's the purpose of it, is just to kind of put the Congress on notice on some of the priorities that the president has. And then the third branch of government, which is to interpret the laws, is the judicial branch, made up of the Supreme Courts and the other lower inferior courts. So legislative branch makes the laws, executive branch executes the laws, and judicial branch interprets the laws. All right, so we talk about the legislative process. So how does a bill become a law? Well, let's first talk about what's a bill. Well, a bill is a general proposal, a legislative proposal of an idea of an item that Congress wants to become law, something to become law. And so when it comes to bills, you have joint resolutions. And the word joint, remember, there's two sides of Congress, House of Representatives and the Senate and the House of Representatives. So the joint resolution means both sides of them must agree and they are joint. Congress also uses the joint resolution process when we're talking about making amendments to the Constitution. Article 5 of the Constitution states Congress may propose such amendments upon 2/3, so that 2/3 of that Congress must agree on that change. Concurrent resolutions. Matters affecting operations of both the House and the Senate are usually initiated by means of a concurrent resolution. Simple resolution, meaning it only affects the House or it only affects the Senate. That's what makes it a simple resolution. So we're just going over some definitions here. All right, so where do these legislation come from? Origins of legislation are recommended by the president, recommended by a member of Congress, or recommended by a committee. Because you think about the structure of Congress, although you have senates, well, they don't do everything themselves. They have committees that work for them or work with them to work on particular issues. So a bill may be generated from the president, a member of Congress, or introduced by a committee member or a committee, actual committee. So how the bill becomes a law. It's introduced by one of those three that I just listed. Consideration by a committee, that means it's a group, it's a board. They have public hearings or markups, meaning that Congress then, okay, let's look at what you're talking about. Kind of like if you write an evaluation, you write an award, typically it doesn't go all the way through. There's somebody who takes it, they mark it up, they write, they put their suggestions. So you kind of figure that's what's happening here in the consideration by the committee. They mark it up. And then you have committee action. Once they mark it up, they give it back, you take it back, you fix it, you bring it back to the floor, the committee take action. Two sides of Congress, House and the Senate. The House and the Senate floor must give it consideration, that same bill. So that bill goes before the House votes on it, the Senate does that same likewise action, because in the end, they must have one bill. So what happens if the House and the Senate do not agree on something? Part of the bill, they have differences. Well, they have to come together in what's called a conference committee. So whenever you hear the word conference, it means that the House and the Senate are coming together to resolve differences. So it doesn't matter if the House sends one person and the Senate sends 10 people to this conference. They're voting as one unit. So whatever the resolve is, that one person on the House side is speaking for the House, and that those 10 people will have one spokesperson to speak for the Senate to resolve the differences, so that when they're done, they have one identical bill to pass forward for the president to sign. Now, what happens once the president signs? Presidential action, approve or veto. There are actually 4 cases. Approval and signature. The president gets the bill, and within 10 days, he signs it and approves it. That bill is then enrolled and it becomes law. There are a couple of instances where the president does not sign, but allows the bill to become law. Now, how is that possible? He doesn't sign that bill, but it still becomes law. So when you read through that information on page 17, is to understand, remember, 10 days. The president has 10 days from when this bill comes. So know that there's a timeline. Of course, the president has to be in the White House at the time received to give him that 10-day period. But what happens is once the bill comes to the president and he doesn't want to veto, he doesn't want to really address it, he might have more important things to do, and he'll say, you know what, I'm not going to do anything within those 10 days. If Congress is in session and he does nothing within them 10 days, that bill automatically becomes law. On the opposite side is something called the pocket veto. Pocket veto means that the president receives the bill, but Congress is already adjourned, mean they're out of session, mean they gone home. So if the president gets the bill, Congress is adjourned, he doesn't sign it within 10 days, it does not become law. So the two scenarios is does not sign but allowed to become law, and pocket veto. Pocket veto means Congress is adjourned, the president doesn't sign it within 10 days, does not become law. And then the regular veto is that the president receives it within 10 days, he vetoes the entire bill and sends it back. Now, remember that 2/3 in your history is that 2/3 of that Congress can override that veto and still make it possible for it to become law. But in most instances, you don't have 2/3 vote, so that veto sticks. All right, what else? Federal budget process. Now, federal budget cycle runs from budget formulation. Then once we formulate the budget request, it goes to Congress for congressional action. And then once Congress performs their congressional actions, we have budget execution. So the different parts of budget formulation starts with guidance. For anything that we do in the budget process, it begins with budget guidance. Organizational develops your draft. So once you get your guidance, you develop your draft. You submit your budget estimates to the Office of Management and Budget, OMB. OMB holds hearing. Again, you want to know, do you have any particular issues with what was submitted and if their hearings need to be held, so you can justify why you are requesting the amount of budget that you have asked for. The president makes a final. So the idea of what we're doing to develop our organizational budget to submit to OMB is for inclusion into the federal, the big budget that the president submits to Congress each year. So you have a list of timelines on page 20, and then you go into the budget formulation process. It gives you all the steps I've just discussed, so I'm not going to go over those again. What I want to touch on now is congressional action. So what happens after the president submits the budget to Congress? Now remember, by law, the president has to submit the budget to Congress no later than the first Monday in February of each year. So decision by the president. Federal, that's dealing with budget. Congressional action, which begins on page 24 and below, starts with page 27, budget resolution. So we're talking the congressional action. When you submit the budget, there's 3 phases: budget resolution, authorization process, and the appropriation process. Let me make sure. Yep. All right. So step 1, budget resolution. So president submits the nation's budget to Congress. What Congress does is a budget resolution. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, what they do is gather all the financial reports. They're like their accountants. So they tell Congress, okay, this is how much we received last year. This is where our expenses. This is our deficit. These are our revenues. This is how much money we owe, right, to different places. They give that financial statement to Congress so that Congress can come up with the guidelines that they're going to use for the upcoming fiscal year's budget. The key to understand about congressional action is which House and which Senate handles the budget resolution process. The good thing is it's the House Budget Committee and the Senate Budget Committee. They both have the name budget in there. The second phase of congressional action is the authorization process. Now, authorization may talk about dollars in there, but we do not get funding to obligate in the authorization process. The sole purpose of the authorization process is to authorize the programs, the categories, the things that we are allowed to do. So regardless of if funding is approved in the authorization process, it does not give us budget authority. So what you need to know here with the authorization process is that the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee are the two parts of Congress that deals with the authorization process. So the diagrams they're showing you on the House and on the Senate side, it goes on their floor, they vote on it, they go to their committees. If they have differences, they come together in a conference committee. Once they resolve the issues in the conference, they take that one bill back to their floors and produces one identical bill for submission to the president for the president to sign. So the authorization process only authorizes program. Regardless if they talk about money in there, they can't give us money. Where do we get our appropriation from? The appropriations process, the third phase of congressional action. The appropriations process is handled by the House and Senate Appropriations Committee. Did I say appropriation? Yes, Appropriations Committee. All right, so same process. You see the diagram is exactly the same. House, Senate, Conference Committee, one bill to the president for the president to sign, and it becomes law. So that's the short version of congressional action. So how many major appropriations we have? We have about 12 major appropriations that Congress approves each year. Budget amendments, that means changes that they may make, or supplementals, meaning from what they approve, they give you supplements, they give you more additional. We don't get a lot of supplementals today. So a good diagram to wrap this up on the congressional actions, the different committees. You need to know which committee handles what particular budget process on page 37. You also, of course, understand about continuing resolution, more so today, these days, because every year, 1 October, if we don't have a brand new appropriation, what happens? Congress says, nope, we're not approving a new budget for the new fiscal year. If we don't have a continuing resolution, the government will shut down. Why would the government shut down? Because Article 1, Section 9, Article 1 says, I'm talking to Congress. Section 9 says, no money can be drawn out of the Treasury unless we have an appropriation law. So continuing resolution, the CR, is a stopgap. It's a temporary appropriation law that's put into place. It's like a Band-Aid to put into place until they can come up with the actual appropriation. So we talk about purpose, time, and amount. So in the federal budget, so once Congress appropriates the money, then once we get the appropriation, the Treasury will say, okay, your bank account set up according to the appropriation law. Office of Management and Budget will issue apportionments to say this is what Congress approved for you. When we get the funding, there's limitations placed on these funding. There's different colors of money, purpose, time, and amount. And so we need to ensure that fiscal law, each financial manager has to be qualified to know the use and the do's and don'ts. So on the bottom of page 39 talks about when Congress appropriates the money, two things actually happens once that appropriation budget is approved. On one side, the Treasury issues Treasury warrant. That's just the notification that your bank account's been set up according to what Congress approved. The second thing that happened is OMB begins the apportionment process. So within 10 days of the Appropriation Act, OMB begins to negotiate. So it's, even though Congress appropriated the money, Department of Defense and other agencies have to then go back to OMB and says, okay, on a SF-132, I need the funding that was approved for me. So you still have to apportion those funding. The reason I'm emphasizing appropriation, when you hear the word appropriation, you know that Congress appropriates money. When you hear the word apportionment, you should know that OMB apportions. The key to success on this examination is understanding your key players, key processes, and key documents. Who's doing what in whatever time frame, what is going on. So SF-132 is the apportionment document that DOD submits to Office of Management and Budget and say, I need the money that Congress appropriates. So that's done within 10 days. And then OMB has 30 days to send them their money. Quarterly after that, the Department of Defense has to submit an SF-133. All of this is discussed on the bottom of page 39, that chart. The SF-133 is an execution expenditure. So now you've given me my money in the beginning. A quarter later, I need to tell you what did I spend it on, to ensure that I'm not spending it on anything else other than what I told you I was going to spend it on and what you gave me the money for. So 41 talks about the appropriation. Congress appropriates, apportionment. OMB apportions the funding to the agencies. The agencies submit an SF-132, which is the apportionment document. Deferrals and rescission. Sometimes Congress appropriates money and the president may go back and say, you know what, can we postpone the use of these funds until later? Or cancellations of fund, rescission, because the budget process begins about 18 months before that fiscal year begins. So by the time, almost 2 years when you look at 18 to 24 months. So by the time that fiscal year begins, priorities may have changed. Things may have changed on what needs to be done. So sometimes you need to do a deferral or a rescission. Management of funds. So once the agencies, DOD, the rest of us get funds, DOD issues allotments. And then once we get our allotments, we commit, we obligate, and we outlay. This is the term you need to use. In our organization, we use the word disbursement. But when it comes to the resource management environment on page 45, you need to know that new term is outlay. An outlay is simply when funds are actually removed from the treasury to pay a bill. It's really disbursement, but you got to learn the terms that are used here. So the federal budget process, performance and review. So once we've been spending the money, then we get audited to make sure that what Congress told us in the beginning, the do's and don'ts, that we have been all along following the guidelines, the do's and don'ts of congressional action. Well, how does Congress give congressional oversight? That's on page 47. I'm sure you've heard GAO, right? Government Accountability Office. Well, the GAO is an independent auditing agency that works directly for Congress. And what GAO does is they come in, they spot check the different DOD agencies, State Department, Education, to ensure that we are staying in line with what was appropriated in the beginning. So remember, GAO will consistently come up through your study materials, and you need to know who they are. GAO, Government Accountability Office, independent auditing agency that works directly for Congress. So summary of the budget process, you got a nice slide on page 49, know those definitions. Just remember, you cannot obligate, you cannot spend funds unless you have some type of budget authority to do so. Later on, you'll know there's like 6 different types of authority mentioned on this chart. Contract authority. So a contractor, they have the authority to obligate funds. Appropriation, when we get the appropriation law, that is also another type of budget authority. So make sure you review the information and the definitions on both of those pages. Remember, the government operates under fiscal year. 1 October of one year to 30 September of another year. That's going to come back to you a little bit later in the form of a practical exercise where they'll tell you what today's date is, and it's probably not going to be 2018. It's probably going to be like 2003, and they're going to ask you, okay, what fiscal year am I in? So make sure you remember 1 October of one year to 30 September of the other constitute one fiscal year. All right, so the last thing that we're going to look at on Section 1.1 is how the federal budget is broken down on page 51. So revenues, that's where we get money coming in. So when you hear, oh, you know what, they're probably going to have to raise taxes. Why? Because that diagram is telling you on the left side, 50% of the money that the government makes comes from individual income taxes. So 34% is the Social Security and the Medicare that they take out of your paycheck. 34% of that makes up that revenue. And then the rest is excise taxes. People we tax for different types of excise taxes. But the bottom line is the 2 major moving parts are individual income tax, Social Security, and Medicare. So that's your revenues. That's money coming in. Well, look at this fancy diagram on the next page, spending. So we make money, but we got a lot of bills. And look at this breakdown. Most of your spending goes to direct or mandatory spending. That means that's bills that we have to pay. And if you look, your mandatory spending for 2018, 62% of all the money that went out were mandatory bills. So let's think about, for example, your mandatory bills, your house payment, your car note, your insurance. So that's like your income. And then 62% of everything that you pay out are mandatory things. Well, that only leaves you with 38% of discretionary budget to go to the movies, to buy food, to go to the store, to buy clothes. 38%. So looking at the country's budget, only 38% is left to do everything else. 62% are bills we have to pay, then 38% is the discretionary budget. But that's not even the gist of it. Of that 38%, the defense takes up half of that, or more than half, 16%, right? National defense discretionary, 16% of that budget. And non-discretionary. So you understand that whenever they're talking about cutting bills, your defense budget is what they look at. Because of that, what is it, 38%, the DOD gets about half of that. and then everybody else. So your Department of Education, Department of State, all your other agencies are now scrambling with the other half amongst themselves. So that's giving you. So I wouldn't necessarily say you have to memorize the percentages per se, but understand the distribution. Who gets more, who gets less, which is mandatory. Mandatory tells you, are you like your Social Security, they have to pay, your Medicare, they have to pay, interest on your debt, and so forth. And discretionary is the money that they have to divide for everyone else. And so this concludes. Make sure you read through in its entirety, like the laws that's on the last page. Oh, I want to point out on 54, 1, 2, 3, 4, the fourth item, it says the 1996 Line Item Veto Act. That particular law was in place when President Clinton was there. And remember, we talked about veto, where the president vetoes a bill and sends the whole thing back? Well, back in 1996, it wasn't like that. Line item veto mean that President Clinton could go look on the bill, and if he didn't like something on it, he could line through it, delete it, and then sign it. And that didn't allow Congress to refute it by the time he made it law. So now what they do is, if you're going to veto anything of the bill, you have to send the whole thing back. So line item veto, I know that came up quite often in the 2013 study guide. So I just wanted to point that out. So thank you again, and I will see you guys again next time. So be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, and also like or share my page with others who are aspiring to be certified financial managers with the Department of Defense. Thank you, and I'll see you again next time.